In 1856, a census taker named Jonathan Pierce walked into the Okefenokee Swamp in northern Florida with a mandate to record every living soul in Charlton County. He carried with him blank ledgers, ink, and the full authority of the United States government. 3 weeks later, Jonathan Pierce emerged from that swamp a changed man. His hair had turned completely white. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, and every single page in his census ledger had been torn out and burned. Before he was committed to an asylum, Pierce wrote one sentence in his diary over and over again, filling 37 pages. They were never born. They were never born. They were never born. What did Jonathan Pierce find in that swamp? What were the families that existed but could never be recorded? And why, to this very day, does the government deny that certain parts of the Okefenokee ever had human inhabitants? This is the story they erased from history. But before we dive into the darkness of Florida's most terrifying historical mystery, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're about to reveal government documents that have never been seen publicly before, and trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. Only 19% of you watching are subscribed, so let's change that. Now, let's enter the swamp. The year was 1856, and America was 7 years away from tearing itself apart in civil war. Florida had only been a state for 11 years, and vast portions of it remained unmapped, unexplored, and according to official records, uninhabited. The federal government, in its endless appetite for documentation and control, had mandated a comprehensive census of every county, no matter how remote. Jonathan Pierce was 32 years old, a former schoolteacher from Massachusetts who had moved to Florida seeking warmer weather for his tuberculosis. He was educated, rational, and meticulous in his work. His previous census assignments in Georgia and the Carolinas had been completed without incident. He was the perfect man for a difficult job, counting the scattered homesteaders and indigenous peoples living in the vast Okefenokee Swamp. The Okefenokee, whose name comes from a Native American word meaning land of trembling earth, is over 700 square miles of wetland straddling the Georgia-Florida border. In 1856, it was considered one of the most impenetrable wildernesses in North America. The swamp was a labyrinth of cypress forests, floating islands, and black water channels that could swallow a man whole if he didn't know the safe paths. The Seminole people had used it as a refuge during the wars with the U.S. government, disappearing into its depths where soldiers dared not follow. But by 1856, the Seminole Wars were over, and the government believed the swamp was now home only to scattered white homesteaders, trappers, and perhaps a few remaining indigenous families. Jonathan Pierce was tasked with finding them all and recording their names, ages, and occupations for the federal census. He entered the swamp on August 3, 1856, with a local guide named Thomas Ridley, a man who claimed to know every navigable waterway in the northern section. They traveled by flatboat, poling through channels barely wide enough for the vessel to pass. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decomposing vegetation. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so dense they had to wear netting over their faces just to breathe. For the first week, everything proceeded normally. They encountered several homesteads on the outer edges of the swamp, families who had carved out small islands of civilization in the wilderness. Pierce dutifully recorded their information. The Hutchinson family, 6 members, farmers and trappers. The O'Neill family, 4 members, living in a cabin built on stilts above the water. The Martinez family, descendants of Spanish settlers, 8 members spanning 3 generations. But on the 8th day, August 11th, something changed. Thomas Ridley guided their boat into a section of the swamp he called the Deep Hollow, a place where the cypress trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the water below. The water here was darker than anywhere else they'd been, black as ink and perfectly still like oil. "Don't drink the water here," Ridley warned, "and don't touch it if you can help it. The deep hollow don't follow natural rules." Pierce, the rational New Englander, dismissed this as swamp folklore. But he couldn't deny that something felt wrong about this place. The sounds of the swamp, the constant chorus of frogs and insects and birds, had gone silent. The only sound was the pole pushing against the water and their own breathing. That's when they saw the first marker. It was a crude wooden post driven into the muddy bank, and hanging from it was a collection of bones. Small bones, arranged in patterns that looked almost like letters or symbols. Ridley stopped pulling immediately. "We need to turn back," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We're here on government business," Pierce replied. "We have authority to go anywhere in this county." "Your government authority don't mean nothing to them," Ridley said. "Them markers mean we're in their territory now, the Hollow folk, and they don't take kindly to outsiders." Pierce had heard rumors of the Hollow folk. During his time in northern Florida, they were described variously as descendants of escaped slaves, renegade Seminoles, Spanish deserters, or some combination of all three. Most people dismissed them as myth, ghost stories told to frighten children. But Ridley's fear was genuine. "If they're real, then they need to be counted," Pierce said firmly. "It's the law." Against his better judgment, Ridley continued pulling deeper into the hollow. They encountered more markers, each one more elaborate than the last. Bones arranged in spirals, preserved animal skulls hanging from branches, and then they began to see the dolls. They were crude things, made from swamp grass and mud and bits of cloth, hanging from the cypress trees like grotesque ornaments. But what made them disturbing was how detailed they were. Each one had a face, carefully molded from clay, and those faces looked disturbingly human, almost like portraits. "They're watching us," Ridley whispered. "Can you feel it?" Pierce couldn't deny it. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, pressing down on them like a physical weight. But he saw no one. Just the endless trees and black water, and those horrible hanging dolls swaying gently in a breeze that didn't exist. They found the first dwelling an hour later. It wasn't a cabin or even a tent. It was built into the swamp itself, a structure that seemed to grow out of the mud and roots, half underground, half submerged in the water. The roof was made of woven branches and moss, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Smoke rose from somewhere within the structure, but Pierce couldn't see any chimney or opening. "Hello," Pierce called out. "I'm Jonathan Pierce, federal census taker. I need to speak with the residents of this dwelling." Nothing. Just silence and smoke. Pierce stepped out of the boat onto what looked like solid ground, but his foot immediately sank 6 inches into the mud. Ridley grabbed his arm. "Don't," the guide hissed. "Please, I got a wife and children." But Pierce, driven by a sense of duty that would prove to be his undoing, pulled free and approached the dwelling. As he got closer, he realized just how large it was. What had looked like a single structure was actually a complex of connected buildings, all built in the same half-submerged style, creating a village that was more underwater than above it. And then he saw them, people. At first he thought they were children, based on their size. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cypress canopy, he realized these were adults. They were emerging from the dwelling, slowly, cautiously, like animals emerging from a burrow. There were dozens of them. Pierce opened his mouth to greet them, to introduce himself and explain his purpose. But the words died in his throat when he saw their faces. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The proportions weren't right. Their heads were too large for their bodies, or their bodies too small for their heads. He couldn't tell which. Their features were compressed, squeezed together, as if their faces had been molded by hands that didn't quite understand human anatomy. And their eyes, dear God, their eyes were huge, bulging from their sockets, reflecting the dim light like an animal's eyes in the dark. Who are you?" Pierce managed to ask, his voice shaking. The largest of them, a man perhaps 5 feet tall with shoulders that seemed too wide for his stunted frame, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice was thick, barely intelligible, his mouth struggling to form the words around teeth that grew at wrong angles. "We are the Hollow," he said. "We've always been the Hollow. We will always be the Hollow, and you should not have come here." Behind this spokesman, more figures were emerging. Pierce tried to count them, his census taker's instinct kicking in despite his terror. 20, 30, 40 people. No, not people, families. He could see family groups, parents and children, though telling who was related to whom was difficult because they all bore such similar deformities. And then he realized with creeping horror why they all looked so similar. They were all related, all of them. This wasn't a community of different families. This was one family. One massive, interconnected family that had been living and breeding in isolation for so long that the genetic damage was written on every face, every twisted limb, every malformed body. "I need to record your names," Pierce said, fumbling for his ledger with shaking hands. "For the census. The federal government requires. We have no names." The spokesman said, "Names are for the outside world. We are the Hollow. That's all you need to know." "But surely you have family names, individual names. I need to know names." The spokesman's voice rose to a shriek that made Pierce stumble backward. "We cannot be named. We cannot be counted. We cannot be recorded. That is how we stay safe. That is how we survive." The crowd of deformed figures surged forward, and Pierce turned and ran. He splashed through the black water, his boots sinking into the sucking mud with every step. Behind him, he could hear them following, moving through their swamp home with a speed and agility that their deformed bodies shouldn't have possessed. Pierce reached the boat to find Ridley already pushing off, terror etched on his face. Pierce grabbed the side of the boat and hauled himself in, the craft nearly capsizing. Ridley pulled frantically, desperately trying to put distance between them and the Hollow folk. But they didn't need to chase the boat. They just stood at the water's edge, dozens of misshapen figures, and watched as Pierce and Ridley fled. And as the boat turned a bend and the dwelling disappeared from view, Pierce could have sworn he heard singing. A strange, discordant song in voices that didn't sound quite human, singing words in a language he didn't recognize. That night, they made camp on a small island far from the deep hollow. Ridley was practically catatonic with fear, refusing to speak or eat. Pierce tried to write down what he'd seen in his census ledger, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. How could he record what he'd seen? How could he explain to the federal government that there was a population living in the swamp that couldn't be counted, wouldn't be named, and appeared to be the result of generations of inbreeding so severe that they barely looked human anymore? He fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of bulging eyes and twisted faces. And when he woke before dawn, he found that his ledger was gone. Pierce and Ridley searched the camp frantically for the missing ledger, but it was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of anyone approaching their island during the night, no footprints in the mud, no disturbance of their supplies. The ledger had simply vanished. They took it, Ridley said, his voice hollow. "They don't want to be recorded. They don't want the outside world to know they exist. That's impossible," Pierce insisted. "We were on an island. The nearest land is 100 yards away. No one could have crossed that water without us hearing." But even as he said it, Pierce remembered the way the Hollow folk had moved through their swamp home, silent and swift despite their deformities. And he thought about the legend Ridley had mentioned before they entered the deep hollow, about the swamp not following natural rules. Any rational man would have left at that point, would have abandoned the census of the deep hollow section and reported back that the area was uninhabited. But Jonathan Pierce was not a man who left tasks unfinished. The federal government had given him a job, and by God, he was going to complete it. "We're going back," he announced. "The hell we are," Ridley shouted. "I don't know what those things are, but they ain't natural, and I ain't going back there." "Then give me the boat and wait here. I'll go alone." In the end, whether out of loyalty, guilt, or a twisted sense of duty, Ridley agreed to guide Pierce back into the deep hollow. But this time, they went armed, carrying rifles and pistols they'd brought for hunting. Pierce also brought a new ledger, blank pages ready to record whatever horrors awaited them. As they pulled back into the dark waters of the hollow, Pierce noticed something he'd missed the first time. The hanging dolls weren't random. They were marking a path, guiding them deeper into the swamp. And the faces on those dolls, the carefully molded clay features, looked familiar. It took him several minutes to realize why. They were portraits of people from the outer settlements, the families Pierce had recorded in the first week of his census. The Hutchinsons, the O'Neills, the Martinez family. All of them were represented in those grotesque, hanging dolls. "They've been watching," Pierce whispered. "They know everyone who lives in the swamp. They know who comes and goes. Then they know we came back," Ridley said, "and they're letting us." That thought was somehow more terrifying than the idea of sneaking up on them. They were being allowed to return. Why? They found the semi-submerged dwelling again, but this time it appeared different. More entrances were visible, more of the complex structure revealed. Pierce realized that what he'd seen the day before was just the tip of a much larger settlement. The Hollow folk hadn't just built a village. They'd constructed an entire underground city in the swamp, hidden beneath the water and mud and trees. And this time, when Pierce called out his introduction, he was answered immediately. The spokesman from before emerged, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came an older figure, a woman so ancient and withered that Pierce couldn't guess her age. She might have been 60, or she might have been 100. Her body was bent and twisted, her features compressed into a face that looked more like a mask than human flesh. But her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with something Pierce recognized as cunning. "The counter returns," she said in a voice like grinding gravel. "The man who wants to name us, to write us down, to make us exist in the outside world." "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," Pierce said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The federal government requires. We know what your government requires," the old woman interrupted. "We know all about your laws and your records and your need to count every living soul. But we are not living souls, not according to your world. We are the Hollow. We are what happens when people choose to disappear." She gestured, and more figures emerged from the dwelling. Pierce saw families, if they could be called that. Groups of individuals bearing the same severe deformities, the same genetic signatures of inbreeding carried to its extreme conclusion. He saw children with adult faces, adults with childlike bodies, people whose arms or legs were stunted or twisted. And yet, despite their physical challenges, they moved with purpose and intelligence. "How long have you been here?" Pierce asked, his census taker's curiosity overwhelming his fear. "Where did you come from?" The old woman smiled, revealing a mouth full of teeth that grew in multiple rows. "We came from many places. Some of us are descended from Spanish settlers who fled into the swamp 200 years ago. Some from escaped slaves who found freedom in the deep hollow. Some from Seminole who wouldn't leave when the government tried to move them. And some from white families who had problems, children who were born wrong, children who couldn't be shown to the world." Pierce felt his stomach turn as he understood. "You're saying this is where people brought their defective children?" "Defective," the old woman repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, that's what the outside world would call us. Defects, mistakes, abominations. But in the Hollow we are just ourselves. And over the generations we have become our own people. We intermarry, we have children, and yes, some of them are born with difficulties, but they are ours. They are us. But this is wrong," Pierce said, his New England morality asserting itself, marrying within families, generation after generation. It creates these conditions. Medical science has proven. Medical science. The old woman spat. Your medical science would kill our children at birth. Your law would separate families. Your God would condemn us as sinners. So we chose a different path. We chose to disappear, to become a people who exist outside your records, outside your history, outside your world. She stepped closer, and Pierce resisted the urge to back away. Up close, he could see that her deformities were even more severe than he'd initially thought. Her skull was misshapen, bulging on one side, compressed on the other. Her spine curved in ways that must have been agonizing. Yet she carried herself with a dignity that made him ashamed of his revulsion. "We cannot be counted," she said softly. "Because if we are counted, we exist. And if we exist in your records, your government will come. They will try to help us. They will try to take our children. They will try to make us normal, and we will all die." "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Pierce insisted. "I just need to record, then record this," the old woman interrupted. She whistled, a sharp sound that echoed through the swamp, and suddenly the area was filled with people. They emerged from the water, from the mud, from hidden entrances Pierce hadn't seen. Dozens of them, no, hundreds. The population of the deep hollow was far larger than he'd imagined. They were all deformed, all bearing the genetic scars of generations of inbreeding. But they were also organized, civilized in their own way. Pierce saw children playing under the watchful eyes of adults. He saw people working together, fishing, preparing food, mending clothes. He saw a community that functioned despite, or perhaps because of, their isolation from the outside world. "We are not monsters," the old woman said. "We are a people who have chosen to exist in the shadows because the light would destroy us. Record us in your book and you condemn us to death. So we ask you, census taker, what will you do?" Pierce stood there, his ledger in hand, faced with an impossible choice. His duty demanded he record every person he saw. His conscience told him that these people, no matter their origins or their deformities, deserve to live free from government interference. And his fear, his deep, primal fear, screamed at him to run and never look back. He made his decision. He opened his ledger and began to write. But what he wrote wasn't names or ages or occupations. He wrote a single sentence, over and over, filling page after page. "No one lives in the deep hollow. The census finds this area uninhabited." The old woman watched him write, and when he finished, she nodded. "You have chosen wisely, Counter. Now go, and never return." Pierce and Ridley turned to leave, but before they could reach their boat, the old woman called out one more time. "Wait, there is one more thing you must see. One more truth you must carry with you, so you understand what you're protecting." She led them to a different part of the settlement, to a structure that sat slightly higher than the others, built on a raised platform above the water. Inside, Pierce saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a nursery, but not like any nursery he'd ever seen. There were a dozen crude cribs, and in each one was a baby. But these babies were so severely deformed that Pierce could barely identify them as human. Some had heads that were twice the normal size. Others had limbs that were mere stubs. One appeared to have no face at all, just a smooth expanse where eyes and nose and mouth should have been. "This is what happens after so many generations," the old woman said quietly. "The blood becomes so concentrated that 1 in every 3 children is born like this. They live for a few months, maybe a year, and then they die. We care for them, love them, give them what comfort we can. But this is the price we pay for our isolation." "Then why continue?" Pierce asked, tears streaming down his face. "Why keep doing this to yourselves?" "Because the alternative is extinction," she replied. "If we join the outside world, we will be scattered. Our community will be destroyed. Our children will be taken from us. We will cease to exist as a people. This way we exist on our own terms, even if the cost is terrible. Pierce fled then, unable to bear any more. He and Ridley raced their boat out of the deep hollow, and they didn't stop until they reached the outer settlements. That night, Pierce took every page he'd written and burned them. He burned the entire ledger, watching as the pages curled and blackened in the fire. But the images wouldn't burn. The faces of the hollow folk, the deformed babies, the old woman's dignified defiance in the face of genetic catastrophe. All of it was seared into his mind forever. Jonathan Pierce tried to return to his normal life. He filed a report with the federal government stating that the deep hollow section of the Okefenokee Swamp was uninhabited and unsuitable for settlement. He moved on to other census assignments. He tried to forget what he'd seen. But the hollow folk hadn't forgotten him. It started with small things. Pierce would wake up to find small bones arranged on his doorstep, the same patterns he'd seen on the markers in the swamp. He'd receive letters written in a cramped, barely literate hand, reminding him of his promise to keep their secret. And worst of all, he'd see them, in crowds, in the corner of his eye, figures that moved wrong, heads that were the wrong shape, watching him from a distance. Were they real, or was he losing his mind? Pierce couldn't tell anymore. Then, in November of 1856, 3 months after his expedition to the Deep Hollow, Pierce received a visitor. It was Thomas Ridley, but the guide was not the same man who had pulled through the swamp with him. Ridley was emaciated, his eyes wild, his hands shaking constantly. "They're in my dreams," Ridley whispered. "Every night I see them, the hollow folk, and they're singing that song, that horrible song. And in the dreams, I understand the words. Do you want to know what they're singing?" Pierce didn't want to know, but Ridley told him anyway. "They're singing about the price of secrets, about what happens to those who know but don't tell, about how silence has a cost, and that cost is paid in flesh and blood and sanity." A week later, Thomas Ridley walked into the Okefenokee Swamp and never came out. Search parties found no trace of him. Pierce's mental state continued to deteriorate. He became obsessed with the idea that the hollow folk were spreading, that more people were joining them, disappearing into the deep hollow to escape the outside world. He began investigating other remote areas, other swamps and forests where isolated populations might be living in secret. And he found evidence. In the Louisiana bayou, he heard stories of the bog people, deformed individuals who lived in the deepest parts of the wetlands. In the North Carolina mountains, there were legends of the hollow heads, inbred families who had lived in isolation for generations. In the pine barrens of New Jersey, tales of the Jersey Devil that sounded suspiciously like descriptions of genetic deformities. Were these all separate populations, or were they connected? Had the hollow folk somehow spread, creating a network of hidden communities throughout America's wildernesses? Pierce became convinced this was true, that there was an entire shadow population living in the forgotten places, breeding in isolation, growing more deformed with each generation, and carefully maintaining their invisibility. He tried to warn people. He wrote letters to government officials, to medical societies, to newspaper editors. But his letters became increasingly incoherent, filled with wild theories and paranoid accusations. People began to avoid him. His former employers at the Census Bureau quietly distanced themselves from him. In March of 1857, Pierce returned to the Okefenokee Swamp, determined to gather proof. He went alone, carrying a camera, a new invention that he believed would finally provide irrefutable evidence of what existed in the deep hollow. He was found 3 weeks later, wandering the outer settlements in a state of complete madness. His camera was gone. 3 fingers on his left hand were missing, severed so cleanly that it appeared surgical. And when questioned about what happened, all Pierce could say was, "They were never born. They were never born. They were never born. He repeated this phrase constantly, writing it on walls, scratching it into tables, muttering it in his sleep. When authorities searched his belongings, they found a new ledger, but every page had been torn out. In the back of the ledger, written in that same cramped, barely literate hand that had sent Pierce letters, was a single message: some people should not be counted. Some families should not exist in records. We are the Hollow. We will always be the Hollow, and we protect our secret. Pierce was committed to the Florida State Lunatic Asylum in Chattahoochee. He spent the remaining 13 years of his life there, never regaining his sanity. The attending physicians noted that he had an irrational fear of children, particularly children with any physical abnormalities. He would scream and hide whenever he saw anyone who didn't look normal. In his final months, Pierce became obsessed with genealogy, drawing elaborate family trees that showed the same names connecting over and over again, generation after generation. He would calculate how many generations of inbreeding it would take to produce certain deformities, how concentrated a bloodline would need to become before it started breaking down completely. And on the day he died, in 1870, Pierce was found with a final message scratched into the wall beside his bed. It wasn't his usual repetitive phrase. It was something new, something that suggested a moment of clarity before death. They're still there. They'll always be there. And every year, their numbers grow. One day, the Hollow will be more real than the world above. After Pierce's death, the federal government made a very deliberate decision. All records of his census work in the Okefenokee Swamp were to be destroyed. The official explanation was that his mental breakdown had rendered his work unreliable. But there were whispers of other reasons, darker reasons, because Pierce wasn't the only one who had encountered the Hollow folk. Over the following decades, there were other reports, always quickly suppressed, always officially denied. In 1889, a hunting party claimed to have found an underground village in the deep hollow, describing deformed inhabitants who spoke in their own language. In 1904, a naturalist studying the swamp ecosystem reported discovering a previously unknown population of genetic anomalies. In 1923, a federal surveyor mysteriously disappeared while mapping the deep hollow section. Each time, the government response was the same: denial, suppression, and destruction of evidence. The area known as the Deep Hollow was eventually designated as off-limits, officially to protect endangered species. But locals knew the real reason. You didn't go into the Deep Hollow because people who went in sometimes didn't come out. And those who did come out were changed. In 1974, the entire Okefenokee Swamp was declared a national wildlife refuge, which meant even stricter control over who could enter and where they could go. The Deep Hollow section was classified as a wilderness area, with no roads, no trails, and no public access without special permits that were rarely granted. But that didn't stop people from trying. In 1982, a group of college students from the University of Florida decided to explore the restricted areas of the swamp as part of an anthropology project. They were fascinated by the legends of the Hollow folk and wanted to prove they were real. They entered the Deep Hollow with cameras, recording equipment, and supplies for a week-long expedition. Only one of them came back. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the swamp 6 days later, incoherent and suffering from severe dehydration. When she recovered enough to speak, she told a story that echoed Jonathan Pierce's experience from over a century before. She described finding a community living in the Deep Hollow, people who looked human but wrong, deformed in ways that suggested extreme inbreeding. She described underground structures, elaborate networks of tunnels and chambers hidden beneath the swamp. She described children who stared at her with bulging eyes that seemed too intelligent for their malformed bodies. And she described the ceremony they witnessed, a wedding ceremony where the bride and groom were clearly brother and sister, and everyone in attendance shared the same distorted features. Her friends, Sarah claimed, had tried to intervene, tried to convince the Hollow folk to leave the swamp and seek medical help. They'd argued that modern medicine could help with genetic conditions, that isolation was no longer necessary. The Hollow folk had responded by taking them. Sarah had escaped only because she'd run while the others were trying to negotiate. Sarah's story was investigated, and search parties did find evidence of the college students' camp. But there was no sign of the other 3 students, no trace of where they'd gone. The investigation was eventually closed, the disappearances attributed to accidental drowning or animal attacks. Sarah Mitchell was quietly encouraged to never speak publicly about what she'd seen, with the implicit threat that her credibility and career would be destroyed if she did. But Sarah did speak, years later, after retiring from academia. In a series of interviews conducted in 2015, she revealed something she'd never told the investigators in 1982. The Hollow folk hadn't just taken her friends, they'd given her something, a message. They told me to tell the outside world that they're still there, still growing, still surviving. Sarah said. They said that for every generation, the outside world becomes more accepting of differences, more tolerant of what was once considered abnormal, and they're waiting for the day when they can emerge from the Hollow without fear, when their deformities won't matter anymore, when they can finally exist in the light. And then they told me something that still haunts me. They said, we are not the only Hollow. There are others, hidden all across America, all across the world. Places where people who don't fit went to disappear, and we're all connected. We all know about each other, and we're all waiting for the same thing. Today, if you visit the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, you'll find a well-maintained tourist destination with boardwalks, observation towers, and guided boat tours. But those tours only cover the outer sections of the swamp. The deep Hollow remains off limits, hidden behind administrative boundaries and environmental protections. Park rangers don't talk about what's in the deep Hollow. When asked, they cite endangered species, fragile ecosystems, and safety concerns. But occasionally, late at night in ranger stations, stories are shared. Stories of strange sounds coming from the restricted areas. Stories of trail cameras that capture images of figures that don't look quite human. Stories of boats found abandoned in the channels leading to the deep Hollow, with no explanation for where their occupants went. In 2019, a genetic research team studying isolated populations applied for permits to conduct surveys in the deep Hollow. Their application was denied without explanation. When they pushed for reasons, they were told that certain areas of the Okefenokee are subject to restrictions beyond the scope of environmental protection, and that further inquiries were not advised. The 1,856 census that Jonathan Pierce was supposed to complete was never finished. To this day, there is no official record of how many people lived in the Okefenokee swamp during that period. That missing data, those families that were never counted, those names that were never recorded, they remain a blank space in American history. A blank space where the Hollow folk still live, still breed, still maintain their isolation from a world that would never accept them. They are the people who were erased from history, but erasure doesn't mean extinction. It just means invisibility, and in the deep Hollow of the Okefenokee swamp, in the places where the water runs black and the cypress trees block out the sun, the Hollow